All right, ladies and gentlemen. So, let's see, where's my paint here? I actually got up off my butt and I decided to look into the what if we were a deep rep paladin and rather than putting nothing but strength gems in all of our gear slots, we decided, and enchants and so forth and so on, we decided to um, do the resistance thing where we all of our resistances get sacrificed, get changed over basically into all of our enchants get changed over into resistances, and all of our gem slots go to resist all gems. And basically, I sat here for a while, got the raw numbers, and did the math, and we're going to talk our way through this. Okay, so up top here we have the all strength gem paladin with kings. You end up around 1700 strength, give or take. You do about 1750 white damage, give or take. Now, the white damage can vary rather all over the place, believe it or not. So, for example, when we didn't have strength gear, I was getting somewhere between 1400 and like 1750 like white hits, and so we just kind of have to generally take the average. And the way I like to do this math in general is I'll very roughly estimate the math and see if there's any major definitive difference between like option A and option B. And only if there's like a really minor difference between option A and option B will I actually sit down and really try to investigate the math more solidly. Seriously, I start making a video and there's a guy who just wants to land his horn out here. Jesus Christ. All right, so moving on. Yeah, so as we can see here, this is the main reason I had to do the math, is because your healing capability as a deep prop paladin or basically a strength based paladin is pretty much dependent upon the amount of strength and attack power that you have. So basically, the more attack power you have on your paladin, the more powerful your heals are. And since we're sacrificing large quantities of strength and large quantities of attack power in exchange for basically resistances, our healing's going to go down also rather significantly. So it ends up being quite a little bit of a math equation dilemma. So anyway, as you can see here, we lose our 300 or closer to 400 strength with kings, give or take. That's a shit ton of strength loss. Also, we lost about 300 attack power from the enchants. This also sounds pretty terrifying and messed up. Interestingly, our white damage didn't go down all that much. I'm not entirely sure why. I suspect it has to do with where our damage is coming from. Like, I knew this, theoretically, but it didn't really register that it would be this significant. So, for example, yeah, on average, about half of your damage is coming from your attack power, and the other half of your damage is just built into your weapon, right? Because your weapon comes with, 300 DPS or some crap like that, and then if you actually do the math on your attack power, you get an extra, 300 DPS from your attack power, and blah, 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 blah. So even though our attack power and our strength went down considerably, our white damage attacks don't go down all that much just because of where our actual damage is coming from. This is the same math that plays out with one-handed paladins. And it's yeah, we lose a lot of DPS going from two-hander to one-hander, but we don't lose any of our attack power-based DPS. So really, you end up having a 25% damage loss when you go from two-hander to one-hander as opposed to 50%. Blah, 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 blah. Of more important note are the FOLs. The FOLs are healing for around 2,100 now, as opposed to 2,400. So in total, we've got about a 14% loss in damage and a 14% loss in healing when we go from all strength gemming and attack power enchanting to resistance gear. Okay, so what does that actually mean, though? Because we need to compare the two. So we look here at the gains, and our gains are telling us that this paladin up here has about a 22% spell damage reduction, and nothing else. Okay? And then if you look at the enchants, comparing that to the resistance build paladin, this is your cut into 3 because of, you can watch the resistance video. Basically, it depends on what you're running into. So this would be like an off resist where the target brought an appropriate amount of spell penetration. And at that point, we're only going to have a 20% spell damage reduction. And then on top of that, we also have our 22% resilience. So again, you should go watch the resist video, but how we figure that out is we times 100 by 0.78. This is to account for our 22% resilience damage reduction. Boom, there we go. And then we need to account for an additional 20% spell damage reduction, because that's what you would have under those circumstances. So we can multiply the remainder by 0.8, and we get, roughly a 38% spell damage reduction. Now that's 37.6, whatever, rounding up. Okay. And that's how you get that, and that's if you were at like a 20% spell damage reduction. And then the other possibility is you run into a target who, I believe this number is, the target it's either an off resistance that the target didn't bring enough spell penetration for, like they brought 75 spell pen as opposed to the 130 that they really should be bringing. They were skimping on their spell pen, or it is a resist that we have some specific resistances into, such as nature damage or shadow resist, blah, 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 blah. Whatever resistances that we're speccing into, it's highly suggested that you do a split resist out in the open world and outside of the arena in general. In arena, this 38% is going to be very, very rare, and this 44% is going to be far, 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 far more common. And of course, how we get this number is we're assuming that it's roughly closer to a 30% damage reduction. So we do our 100 times 0.7, that's our 30% damage reduction. Then we do times 0.78, that's our 22% damage reduction. And voila, we're close to a, that's closer to like a 46, 45% damage reduction. But we're just saying 44. We rounded this one up, we're rounding this one down, whatever, moving on. And lastly, we have the our enemy is actually using resistances that we came to the party with. Like we have Shadow and Nature resist, and they're bringing Shadow and Nature resist. And yeah, we got about a 40% damage reduction, yada, yada, yada. Okay. What I'm trying to say is we're being very thorough and very conservative with our resistances. I'm not favoring anything. It won't be an uncommon scenario that you run into targets where you have 60, 63% spell damage reduction against them because they have no spell pen whatsoever, and you have the ability to, yeah, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what this equates into is that if we have a 22% spell damage reduction, due to how damage reduction works, we have a 29% increase in, this should actually, I can't back it up anymore, that sucks. It translates into a 29% increase in both of our standing HP and our effective healing, because, again, that's how damage reduction works, right? I'll give you an example of this. Say you have a 50% damage reduction, okay? Well, that means that you effectively have plus 100% more HP, and any kind of healing effects that you're doing on yourself or you're catching from anywhere have plus 100% effectiveness because of this 50% damage reduction that you have. That's how damage reduction works, okay? It increases both your standing HP pool, and it increases any kind of healing effects that you have on yourself. So a 22% spell damage reduction from nothing but resilience is actually giving us a 29% increase in our standing effective HP, our standing hit points, and it's giving us increased healing of 29%. Why this matters? Okay. Again, I talked about this at the end of the resist video, but why this matters is, as a paladin, when we're trying to jump on an enemy spellcaster, we're going to pay for that in our HP. And our common experience is going to be, we can close the difference between A to B and get on top of enemy spellcaster, but we'll only have like 30% of our HP pool left, effectively, right? Where's my calculator again? Okay, so let's, and on top of that, once we're physically in contact with our target, because if we're Preg Paladin or if we're Deep Ret Paladin, which is what we're examining right here, we're going to be able to heal ourselves off of our Art of War Flash of Lights, which is what we're going to be talking about in a moment. And our Art of War Flash of Light healing will be augmented by our damage reduction, right? Okay, so what this means is the more damage reduction that we have, the more HP we're going to have when we get on top of the enemy spellcaster, and the longer and the more effective healing we're going to have while we're beating the crap out of our enemy. if you're following me on that. So we're basically double dipping in effectiveness as Paladins here. So for example, with this 29%, let's say I was getting on top of the target with 30% life remaining. Yeah, so 30% life remaining, which means we basically lose 70% of life. But if I magically was able to pull an extra 29%, 22% or 29% gain damage reduction out of my butt, what we'd end up seeing is something like this: 1.29 equals, and then I have to minus 70 because that's how much damage we were taking. We took 70% damage under normal circumstances, but now we're a little bit buffer. Boom. Okay, so what this means is if I was gaining 29%, whereas before I would be on top of the target with only 30% life, suddenly I'm on top of that same target with 59% life. And we haven't even taken into effect the increased effectiveness in our healing and blah, 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 blah. So that's just the difference between having standing hit points and not standing hit points. We're just looking at the standing hit points in general there. All right. Hopefully I've made my point as to all these numbers that I'm about to talk about right here. Okay, so what this 22% means is it's about a 29% increase in your effective HP, and it's a 29 your standing HP, and it's an increased effectiveness in healing. 38% is a 61%, 44% is a 79%, and then 55% ends up being a 122% increase. The percentages down here are just the differences, right? So the difference between this 38% and this 22% is a 32% increase. The difference between this 79 and this 29 is a 40% increase. And the difference between this 29 and this 122% is a 93% increase. But because our FOLs are weaker, we need to calculate that in. All right, so we end up having so that this is me doing the math down here. So at FOLs that heal for 2,400 and a 29% increase in their effectiveness, because we have 22% spell damage reduction from resilience, this is the effective healing per second, or per second. It should be per FOL, right? So even though this number says 2,400 FOL healing, every time you heal yourself for an FOL, it's more effective due to the damage reduction. It's closer to 3,100. And then this is the number for our 38%. And as you can see, it's only a 9% increase in healing. So even though we lost 14% base healing from changing A to B, you can still see that our healing effectiveness is still increased by about 9%. We haven't done anything to affect the damage loss. We'll talk about that in a second, right? We're still at a 14% damage loss, which sucks. But looking at our lowest possible resist, you can see that we're still gaining a rather healthy chunk of effective healing, to say nothing of the increase in the effective hit points that we get on top of the target with. Effectively, see this, since it's a 32%, and we already did the math on the other, and blah, blah, blah. What I'm trying to say is, if at 22% and these stats up here, you would get on top of the target with like 30% life remaining, since this is now the number you're dealing with, and this is the difference that you're dealing with, and we already did the math on the 29%, and we saw that it was close to 60%, expect to be getting on top of the target with over 60% of your HP bar remaining, just because of the sheer terrifyingness of this 38% damage reduction. Okay, but we're still just looking at the base healing. So under worst case situations, you're going to be getting on top of the target with damn near twice. We can't really calculate that correctly. You're going to be getting on top of the target with a hell of a lot more HP, and you're going to be getting on top of the target with more effective healing, essentially. And that's under worst case scenarios at our 38% damage reduction. Once we start getting to the 44% damage reduction, which is closer to our average damage reduction that we're going to experience over the course of just about any encounter we have with a spellcaster, all these numbers start going through the roof. So expect to be getting on top of them with 70, 80% of your life remaining. and then your effective healing is increased by like 21%, which is a substantial increase to your effective healing when you're on top of the target. And of course, if it's against a target that you actually do effectively resist, then just forget about it. You have 50% more increased healing. They literally can't damage you. It's an absolute nightmare for them. Moral of the story is, despite these massive losses of like 14% loss in damage and 14% loss in base healing, the math is just showing that this Paladin is likely to be a superior Paladin build in general, at least when you're dealing with enemy spellcasters. When you're dealing with enemy melee classes, this Paladin will be definitively a weaker Paladin, like straight up, no joke. But if you know anything about deep rep Paladins in fights with other classes that are melee classes, you'll know that when the enemy melee class is bursting, you're supposed to go sword and board with you pretend you're a Preg Paladin. This is if you're not even a Preg Paladin, right? So if you're a deep rep Paladin and the enemy class is bursting on you, you go sword and board with a one-handed spell damage healing weapon, and you just try to heal through it. And we actually have a substantial loss to our healing under those circumstances. We still got that 14% reduction in our healing, which isn't the greatest thing in the world. But deep rep Paladins are so good in melee with other classes, it's probably not that big of a deal. It might cost you the fight. It might not cost you the fight. It really depends. Yada, yada, yada. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. It might end up being a big of a deal, but I would say at best it's 50-50. Like against an equally geared opponent, it'll make your life harder because of that 14% loss in effective healing. But you're trading that out for having a much, much, much better matchup against the vast majority of enemy spellcasters. Personally, I think it's a really good trade for the deep rep Paladin. For the Preg Paladin, you're more than happy with this trade because of just how much of a tanky bastard you are in actual melee. That a 14% loss in your effective healing against pure enemy physical damage dealers who are going to stand toe-to-toe in melee with you is that you're perfectly happy with this. You're like, I can probably take that loss on the chin and I'll still be more than fine to win these particular fights. Life will be a little harder, but you'll probably definitely win. And of course, this is in exchange for actually having a chance, if not outright beating most enemy spellcasters as Preg Paladin. What else is there to talk about? I think that's pretty much the general conclusion. I was going to talk about something else, but yeah, so the general conclusion is against enemy spellcasters, the resistance gear is substantially, if not far and away better than going pure damage. I haven't compared this to like stacking pure resilience, right? If you stack pure resilience, this 22% number changes to a 32%. And then you have to compare, but you still lose all the same stuff, right? You'd still lose, you still have a 15% reduction in your white damage. You'd still have or your total damage overall, and you'd still have a 14% loss in your FOL damage or your healing and well, yeah. So you can compare the two, but moral of the story is, I'm pretty certain that the Resist Paladin build is still going to be really, 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 really good. And it's definitely a superior build for taking on enemy spellcasters. And it's probably going to be the best build possible for Preg. And then if you're a deep rep Paladin, it's going to be just a different flavor of the same story, more than likely. So what'll end up happening is you'll have a much, much, much easier time against enemy spellcasters, but you'll have a noticeable harder time against enemy melee classes, but you're definitely within the realm if you've ever actually watched duels between deep rep Paladins and other enemy melee classes. Deep rep Paladins are almost always favored against other melee classes. That's when they're gearing with the strength and the white damage and all that kind of stuff. So I suspect even with this 14% loss in your DPS output and your effective healing, that there's a really good chance that it's like 50-50. It's like a fair fight at that point. And I think a lot of the fight will come down to who's better geared. Not to mention, like, who's better with knowing what to do and yada, yada, yada. So, for example, if you run into a person who's not as well geared as you, these stats aren't going to matter. You're probably just going to win. If you run against a target who knows what they're doing and they're better geared than you, you're probably going to lose. Whereas if you were the more traditional Deep Rat Paladin, you could have probably won that fight. But this is traded off for, like, any spellcaster you come up against. You are just so much more comfortable fighting them than you would be otherwise. In fact, it'll probably be a straight-up joke and an easy win for you under the vast majority of circumstances. So, total win rate, in my opinion, is far superior. If you don't know, the life of a normal Deep Rat Paladin, which would be this Deep Rat Paladin up here, is you can take on just about any class that's willing to fight you in melee. It's kind of the same life as the Preg Paladin. Any class that's willing to fight you in melee, you're going to cut them to absolute pieces. And then any class that wants to keep you at range and is a magic damage dealer, you're probably going to lose against as a Deep Rat Paladin, and that's just your life. Comparing that to the resistance-based Paladin, it's almost the complete inverse. It's going to be questionable, like 50-50, whether or not you can beat most enemy dedicated melee classes. But against enemy spellcasters, you are favored 6 ways from Sunday. Like even gear, you're probably going to win, straight up. And personally, I consider that to be a very good trade-off. So it'd be like the traditional Deep Rat Paladin's like, oh, wants to fight me in melee? Cool, I win. It's an enemy spellcaster at range. Do they know what they're doing? Ah, shit, they know what they're doing. Fuck, I lose. And then the Resistance Paladin is running up to people and saying, okay, how's your gear compared to my gear if you're a melee class? How are your skills compared to my skills if you're a melee class? If you outgear me and we're on par with skills, then I probably lose. If we're equal in gearing and we're equal in skill, then it's probably going to be a fair fight where I'm even slightly disadvantaged. Depends on RNG, crits, blah, 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 blah. And then if I have superior gear and or superior skills, then I probably just straight up win those matchups. So very questionable, very even, very dynamic in the melee fights. And then I run into enemy spellcasters, and I'm just laughing my ass off. Thank you very much, I win. And this also goes, but that's for Deep Ret. Preg Paladin's going to have a completely different experience. So the Preg Paladin's going to go into things, and they're going to be like, oh, are you willing to fight me in melee? Awesome, I probably win. I was winning anyways with the pure strength build, but I was winning spectacularly hard and over the top. So I can just straight up take these losses to DPS and losses to effective healing under those circumstances, and I'll probably still win that fight like 75% of the time, easy. And then against enemy spellcasters, you also have like a 75% chance to win, if not higher. A little bit of a different lifestyle than your traditional Preg Paladin. Your traditional Preg Paladin runs up against enemy melee classes and is like, all right, I win, and I win hard. Get bent. And then you run into enemy spellcasters, and you're like, all right, I lose hard. I guess I get screwed. And instead, you've switched that over to like a 75% win rate in both cases. The reason why it's not a 100% win rate in both cases is because you're still going to struggle against enemy spellcasters because you just have to get on top of them. It's going to be a little bit of an RNG fest. Are they critting the crap out of you when you're trying to close the distance, yada, yada, yada. Is it a 38%, a 44%, or a 55%? If it's a 38%, we're probably going to have our work cut out for us. But if it's a 44 or a 55, we're probably going to win that fairly easily. Yada, yada, yada. Also, you don't have Giga Chad levels of damage when you get on top of them. Like, even this somewhat nerfed Deep Ret Paladin, when it physically gets on top of people, it's going to do a lot of damage. That's something else we got to talk about. That was the other thing I want to talk about. Right. So the Resistance Paladin against enemy melee classes straight up has a 14% loss in damage. But you'll find that that's not actually the case against classes that want to kite you. And the reason for this has to do with time on target, right? Like, your actual DPS as a Deep Ret Paladin and as a Preg Paladin can be calculated via a mathematical equation of you jump on a target, you do X amount of front-loaded damage. What front-loaded means is front-loaded is the damage that's been stored up on you that all of a sudden lances out and hits the target. So, for example, if you have like a let's say you have a 2 second swing weapon and you jump on the target and you get that first attack in, you get those first 2 seconds for free. You get your judgment damage, your first judgment damage out for free. Basically, it's like, yeah, your abilities might have a 6 second cooldown, but in the first 6 seconds of you getting on top of your target, you get to use them twice. Because why? Because one of your ability recharges was already loaded and ready to rock. We call that front-loaded damage. Okay, so it's your front-loaded damage. Reckoning falls into this category. When you wreck bomb someone, you've got swing speed times 5 front-loaded damage, right? Anyway, so you get your front-loaded damage, and then after your front-loaded damage is expended, it's just a mathematical equation of your DPS into the target, right? Or you can think of it in terms of like every 10 seconds. So it's like, okay, I jump on the target, I can be there for 10 seconds, what's coming out of me? Well, we're going to get 2 judgments on them, we're going to get 3 Crusader strikes on them, we're going to get 2 of our Divine Storms, our Whirlwinds that have a 10-second cooldown on them, we're going to get X number of auto attacks and like 2 judgments and blah, 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 blah. Like that's what's going to flow out of us and into the target as far as damage is concerned. And then after those 10 seconds, they probably have some spell to effectively get us off of them for a while, and then we're playing run at the enemy or having to heal ourselves or blah, 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 blah. Right? And so for traditional deep rep Paladin, a lot of the math comes down to, can I physically get on top of my enemy and then do enough damage before they can get me off of them to fucking kill them? Otherwise, we're up shit creek without a paddle. However, this resistance style Paladin is going to be able to stay on top of their target for a far higher amount of time than you would think they would be able to. And the reason for this is multifold. Number one, you just have you have a significantly increased HP pool when you're physically on top of them, which means you're not under a lot of pressure to need to stop and attacking them and heal yourself. So basically, for enemy classes, there's 2 ways for them to get you off you. I know for people who have watched my videos for a long time, I'm saying the same stuff I've said for years. But when we're physically on top of somebody, there's 2 effective ways for them to get us off of them. Number 1 is they can throw some hard CC our way and then get distance off of it. Number 2 is they can do so much damage to us that it forces us to need to stop, root ourselves in place, and heal, which effectively they've hard CC'd us, and then they can get some distance and yada, 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 right? If we're jumping on them with a significantly higher HP pool than normal, we're effectively countering one of those. So we're saying to them, yeah, that option of doing more damage to us, that's not on the table anymore. You're going to have to throw some hard CC at us. The vast majority of hard CC that's going to be thrown at us is going to be a spell resistance check. Which means there's a really good chance that we're going to resist it. At the 38%, there's a 20% chance that we'll resist. At the 48%, there's a 30% chance we'll resist. Again, go watch the resist video. And then at a 55% chance, there's a 40% chance that we're going to resist any hard CC that they throw our way. Why that's absolutely terrifying for us as Paladins is because we also have PvP Trinket and Bubble to counter enemy hard CC casted at us. So you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to take 3 resistance checks to physically get us a Paladin off of a target, right? Like, let's say I'm a, what's a good example? Like, let's say I'm on top of a Warlock, for example, right? And they have to cast Fears to get us off of them. Well, the first fear that hits you, okay, it has to go through a resistance check, and then you can trinket it. And then the second fear they hit you with, it has to go through a resistance check, and then you can bubble it if you so desire, or you can sit the fear. There won't be a third resistance check for any real length of time. They'll have to wait out the 10 seconds or so it takes to reset, because if they try to cast a third fear and they successfully get it, even though theoretically we have bubble up, like let's say you bubble and canceled, and they're like, oh, you bubble canceled, cool, I'm just going to fear you again. It's only going to last like 2 seconds or some ridiculously short duration like that before it comes off, and the stupid Paladin is just going to be right back on top of you again. So they have to wait it out. But when they finally do wait it out, they can cast another fear, and it's going to go through another resistance check, and then finally they got you off of them, right? And that's assuming they didn't fail any of those resistance checks. And that's also the case that you're dealing with a class that if they fail a resistance check, they can just very quickly cast another fear. A lot of classes can't do that. A lot of classes are trying to, snare you. They're trying to frost shock you, and they have a major cooldown in between those two. So they frost shock you, and you full resist that crap or some shit like that. And it's like, oh, even though you could normally just cleanse it off of you or freedom it off of you or some shit like that. Blah, 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 blah. So don't be surprised if your resistances allow you to stick to the target a lot more than they should. And definitely don't be surprised at all if you have way more HP when you're physically on top of the target. So you're much more comfortable just beating the crap out of them. The moral of the story is there's a lot of little things going on here that start negating this 14% loss in DPS. Because the traditional Ret Paladin only has about 10 seconds of time on the target to get the job done. And if they don't get the job done, they're usually in a bad place afterwards. They've expended a lot to do so, yada, yada, yada. Whereas the Resistance Paladin expect to jump on top of a target and get closer to 15 seconds of time on target before they're able to get you off of them. And if you do the math, you can very quickly see that, even if we're on top of them for 12 seconds as opposed to 10 seconds, we're effectively sticking them with, 15% more damage if you factor in the front-loaded aspect, yada, yada, yada. So very quickly, just by the sheer act of us getting more seconds of time on target, we're making up for our 15% loss in effective damage. The only time this will really affect you negatively, especially as like a deep rep paladin, is if you're in a scenario where it's your damage output versus your enemy's healing per second. So it's like the amount of effective damage you're putting into them, like their HP loss per second versus their healing per second. If you find yourself in that situation, you can very much often lament the fact that you have 14% less damage. But to be perfectly honest, those scenarios are few and far between. So for example, it's very hard even for a deep ret paladin with shit tons of attack power, going all in on damage, to be able to 1v1 a healer. Most healers 1v1 just heal way too damn much. Even arms warriors struggle to kill healers 1v1, so don't be surprised if you as a deep ret paladin struggle to kill healers 1v1. And to be perfectly honest, the 14% loss in DPS, you'll lament it, but the grass is not greener on the other side of the fence under those circumstances. Even with the 14% increase, you just end up sitting there and you pray to God for to get nothing but crits. You're like, please let all my auto attacks just crit in a row so I can kill this stupid healer. And the healer's just over there going lol and healing through your stuff like it's nothing. And it should be important to note that even arms warriors struggle under those conditions, which is really kind of funny. Yeah, and just get a different flavor of Ret Paladin in general. So yeah, you can try it as Deep Ret. I think it's a little bit better as being a Preg Paladin, because the Deep Ret Paladin is going to struggle against enemy melee classes, whereas the Preg Paladin is like... The Preg Paladin does not mind a 14% loss in damage and a 14% loss in healing when dealing with enemy melee classes. They're not even going to bat an eye at those losses. Whereas the gains that they get from enemy spellcasters are much needed and very much desired for Preg Paladin. Whereas the Ret Paladin, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, I'm going to end the video here, and Deus Vult, boys. Find this thing, and come on, OBRS, you can do it. Alright, later, guys.